damp castles, where the air is cold and people wrap themselves in animal skins. This is how we often imagine medieval England. Images of icy bedrooms come to mind, where the only source of heat is a tiny hearth. However, this picture is most likely a gross distortion of reality. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people were very inventive and knew how to cope with the cold using the materials available to them. They found ways to create comfort and keep their homes warm. Instead of heating the entire room, they focused on heating the most important thing, their bed. To do this, they used massive beds with canopies, creating a kind of room within a room. Heavy wool curtains protected against drafts and retained heat. And interestingly, they managed to sleep in warmth that was perhaps even more comfortable than in our modern homes with central heating. How did they do it? Watch the video to the end and you'll find out how medieval people managed to beat the cold. We, modern people, are accustomed to the comfort of central heating. For us, if there are no radiators in the house, it is already a problem. But for medieval people, cold was not something unusual. It was part of their lives, and they learned to cope with it. Their houses were built to retain heat as much as possible. Thick stone or clay walls, small windows, often closed with shutters. All this helped to keep the heat inside. They did not try to heat the entire house. Their main goal was to create a microclimate in certain areas, for example, in the bedroom. They understood that it was practically impossible to heat a huge stone hall, so they focused on what they could control, and in this they were true masters. Their houses were not airtight like ours. They had many cracks through which cold air could penetrate, but they used this to their advantage. They built their houses so that warm air from the fireplace circulated throughout the house, and cold air escaped through the cracks. It was a kind of natural ventilation that helped them keep the air fresh. In addition to architectural solutions, medieval people used a whole arsenal of household tricks. Particular attention was paid to furniture and textiles. Massive beds with canopies were not just a luxury, but a necessity. Heavy wool or linen curtains that completely covered the sleeping area created a kind of room within a room. Inside this improvised shelter, the heat emitted by the body did not dissipate throughout the cold room, but was retained, ensuring a comfortable sleep. Canopies and curtains also protected against drafts that penetrated through numerous cracks in the walls and windows. Textiles played a key role. People slept in several layers of clothing, often wearing heavy woolen nightshirts. Bedding was made from sheep's wool, which is excellent at retaining heat. In winter, beds could be further insulated with blankets stuffed with feathers or down, which provided additional insulation. Foot warmers were used to warm the feet. Clay or metal vessels filled with hot water or smoldering coals. These warmers were placed in the bed sometime before bedtime to warm the sheets. It was a simple but incredibly effective way to make the bed warm and cozy even on the coldest nights. Another important aspect was the proper use of fire. In most homes, the main source of heat was a fireplace or hearth. Unlike modern fireplaces, medieval hearths were often located in the center of the main hall, allowing heat to spread throughout the room. Food was cooked over the fire, and the heat from the hearth, mixed with the smells of food, created a feeling of home comfort. Smoke escaped through special openings in the ceiling or walls, and soot settled on the walls, adding an extra layer of insulation. Clothing was also multi-layered. The main material was wool, coarse but very warm. People wore several shirts, tunics, and cloaks. Depending on status, clothing could be thinner or thicker, but the principle of layering remained the same. Outerwear often had hoods and was lined with fur, which provided additional protection from the wind and cold. Feet were protected by thick leather boots and woolen stockings. Hands were hidden in fur muffs or gloves. Every detail of clothing had its own function in combating low temperatures. Dampness was another problem that had to be dealt with. In the absence of ventilation and with a large number of cracks, the walls in houses were often damp. People combated this by keeping fires burning in fireplaces and hearths for as long as possible. The heat from the fire dried the air and walls, making it more comfortable to stay indoors and preventing mold growth. In addition, The floors in houses were often earthen and covered with straw. This provided additional insulation from the cold ground and made the floors softer and warmer. The straw was changed several times a year, which also helped to keep the floors clean. Finally, the general lifestyle was geared toward conserving energy and heat. In winter, people worked less outside and spent more time around the hearth, doing crafts, telling stories, and simply relaxing. Families and communities gathered in one room to keep each other warm. Living together was not only a social norm, but also a practical necessity. Instead of everyone heating their own small corner, they joined together to make the most efficient use of the heat from a single hearth. It was the embodiment of the principle of one for all and all for one. Thus, medieval people did not simply endure the cold, but actively fought it using all the means available to them. Their solutions were not as technological as ours, but they were based on a deep understanding of nature and physics. Their ingenuity and adaptability allowed them to create comfort and warmth even in the harshest conditions. Do you think that we, modern people, have completely forgotten how to cope with the cold without technology? Write what you think about this in the comments. The most important piece of furniture in a medieval home, and perhaps the warmest, was the bed. It was not just a place to sleep, but a real bastion of warmth and comfort, the center of home life. The bed was huge, often with a high frame and a ladder, which gave it a monumental appearance and additional protection from the cold. Not only the owners of the house slept on it, but also their guests, which made it a kind of social center. The bed frame was made of sturdy wood, and thick mattresses stuffed with straw or feathers lay on top of it. It was a real multi-layered construction that helped to retain heat. The first layer was the mattress itself. Although straw was hard, it provided good insulation from the cold air. In wealthy homes, straw was replaced with feathers, which made the mattress much softer and warmer. Sheets of coarse linen were spread on top of the mattress, followed by thick woolen blankets and bedspreads. Each of these covers added another layer of insulation, trapping the heat given off by the sleeper's body. Sleeping in the same bed was not only the norm, but also a necessity. The more people slept in one bed, the warmer they were. Human body heat was the most reliable and accessible source of heat in that era. People slept close to each other, sharing their warmth, which was their way of surviving the cold nights. This custom was called body warming and was common among all classes of society, from peasants to nobility. For many, it was the only way to keep from freezing in the icy bedrooms of castles. In addition to thermal insulation, the bed had another important function: protection from drafts. High wooden frames that raised the mattress above the floor helped to avoid the cold air that accumulated below. Beds with canopies were particularly effective. Thick woolen or linen curtains covering the bed on all sides created a kind of room within a room inside it. This allowed warm air to be retained, preventing it from mixing with the cold air in the rest of the room. In wealthy homes, these canopies were decorated with intricate embroidery and patterns, which also served as a status symbol. The bed was not just a piece of furniture, but a symbol of status and wealth. The taller and more beautiful the bed, the more noble its owner. In castles where the main halls were huge and poorly heated, a bed with a canopy became the only truly warm place. People not only spent their nights in it, but could also have breakfast, receive guests, and even work without leaving the warmth of their blankets. In some cases, the bed could be equipped with special heating devices, such as ceramic vessels with hot water or coals which were placed under the blanket. The location of the bed in the house was also important. They tried to place it away from windows and doors, which were the main sources of drafts. In peasant houses, where there were no separate bedrooms, the bed was often placed against the wall bordering the hearth or fireplace so that it could receive additional heat. In castles, bedrooms were located on the upper floors, as warm air rises, making them slightly warmer than the lower rooms. Interestingly, the practice of sleeping together in one bed was so widespread that even in hotels and inns, travelers could sleep together, sometimes even people who were strangers to each other. It was economically advantageous and, of course, much warmer. Over time, with the development of heating technology and building materials, this practice became a thing of the past. Beds became smaller, and separate bedrooms became the norm. Thus, the medieval bed was much more than just a place to rest. It was a technological marvel of its time, designed for maximum warmth and comfort. It was the heart of the medieval home, a place where the family gathered to survive the cold nights, and a symbol of survival in harsh conditions. But why was the bed not just a piece of furniture, but a real lifeline in the fight against the cold? And why did the whole family sleep on it? Let's talk about this further. In a medieval home, bedding was a true work of art. It was created not only for beauty, but also for maximum heat retention. Each element had its own important role. Feather beds were stuffed with swan or goose down, which was considered an excellent insulator. They were so thick and voluminous that when a person lay down in bed, they sank into them like a cloud. This airy filling created a kind of thermal cushion that prevented cold from penetrating from below and retained the heat coming from the body. Several layers of blankets and quilts were often placed under the feather bed. They were usually made of thick, coarse wool. They were heavy and dense, which helped to retain heat. Sometimes they were made of several layers to create an air gap, which also served as insulation. The blankets were often embroidered with patterns, which in addition to their decorative function, helped to hold the layers together. This multi-layered approach was the key to success. Instead of one thick blanket, people used several thin ones, which created air pockets, known to be the best heat insulators. Finally, fur blankets made from animal skins, such as bears, wolves, or foxes, were placed on top of the quilts. The fur was another layer of insulation that helped retain heat. These fur blankets were a symbol of wealth and status, but they also served a practical purpose. Not only did they provide extra warmth, but they also protected the lower layers of blankets from moisture and dirt. Fur was the ideal material because it was very dense and repelled water well. In addition to these basic elements, there were other equally important ones. For example, foot warmers. People used various devices to warm their feet in bed. These could be clay or metal vessels filled with hot water or smoldering coals. These warmers were placed under the blanket sometime before bedtime to warm the bed. This simple but effective method made the bed warm and cozy even on the coldest nights. Another important element was warm nightgowns. They were made of thick wool and were very long to cover the legs. They were worn by both men and women. Sometimes they were so thick that they resembled coats more than nightgowns. This was another way to retain the heat emitted by the body. Nightcaps were worn on the head to prevent heat loss through the head. Beds also had their own special features. In wealthy homes, they were very high, and a special ladder had to be used to get into them. This was done in order to sleep away from the cold floor and drafts, which always found their way into the house. High beds were not just a sign of luxury, but a well-thought-out engineering solution. All these measures, from thick feather beds and multi-layered blankets to hot water bottles and warm clothing, were part of a complex system of survival in harsh conditions. People didn't just put up with the cold, they actively fought it using the materials and knowledge available to them. They understood that the key to success was to create multiple insulating layers and minimize heat loss. Thus, medieval bedding was not just comfortable, it was vital. Every item from the feather bed to the fur blanket had a function and was part of a unified system that allowed people to survive the cold nights. The canopy, which we see today in films as a symbol of luxury, was a necessity in the Middle Ages. It was a kind of mini-room inside a large room. Heavy, thick curtains hung from the canopy and covered the bed on all sides. This design was not just a decorative element, but a well-thought-out engineering solution aimed at preserving heat. When the curtains were closed, they created an insulated space where the heat emanating from the sleeping bodies did not escape. It was a kind of natural blanket that helped people stay warm. The curtains were made of thick fabrics such as wool or linen, which were excellent insulators. Thanks to their density and structure, these materials effectively trapped air and prevented heat from escaping. Even the smallest gaps between the curtains were closed, creating a space that was as airtight as possible. Canopies also protected against drafts that could penetrate through gaps in walls and windows. In the Middle Ages, windows were not like ours. They were small, often without glass, and were closed only with shutters, which could not provide a complete seal. This was a problem during the cold season, and the canopy became the only reliable barrier against the icy air. In addition, the ceilings in castles were high, and all the warm air rose to the top, leaving the lower part of the room cold. The canopy allowed people to sleep in an area where the temperature was comfortable. But the most interesting thing is that the canopy and curtains helped not only against the cold, but also against other surprises. Medieval castles and houses had many unwanted neighbors: rats, mice, and insects. The canopy served as a kind of barrier, protecting sleepers from these guests. This added another level of comfort and security that we, as modern people, cannot even imagine. Imagine sleeping while something with paws could run across the ceiling. Sounds scary, right? In addition to physical protection, the canopy also had social significance. It was a symbol of status and wealth. The more complex and beautiful the canopy, the more noble its owner. The canopy was not just a piece of furniture, but an element that distinguished the bed, making it the center of home life. In it, you could receive guests, discuss business, and even have breakfast without getting out from under the warm blankets. Thus, the canopy was not just a decorative element, but a multifunctional device that served for thermal insulation, protection from drafts, and hygienic protection. All this makes the canopy one of the most important items in a medieval home, helping people survive in harsh conditions. But how did they keep warm if there was no fireplace or hearth in the house? We will tell you more about this later.
Yes, my dear.
In addition to beds, medieval people had other, more hidden sources of heat, which we would today call primitive, but incredibly effective. They used all the materials available to them to create comfort when the cold raged outside. One such source was hot water bottles. They were made of clay, metal, or even wood. They were filled with hot water or hot coals and placed under the blanket to warm the bed before bedtime. This simple but very effective method made the bed warm and cozy so that a person could immediately fall into a comfortable sleep, rather than waiting for their own body to warm up the icy bed. Another common source of heat was a pot of coals. It was a clay pot in which smoldering coals were placed. It was placed under the bed and gradually warmed the air around the sleeping area. This was very effective, as the heat rose and warmed the bed, creating a small but very important microclimate. This method was especially popular in homes that did not have a fireplace in every room. The pot of coals could be moved from room to room, which made it very convenient. Hot stones were another way to keep warm. People placed large flat stones in the oven or hearth, where they heated up. They were then wrapped in cloth to prevent burns and placed in bed. The stones retained heat for a long time and were an excellent source of warmth. This method was especially popular in rural areas where stones were readily available. It was a kind of natural radiator that could be used repeatedly. In addition, people used the heat of animals. In peasant homes, animals often lived in the same part of the house as people. The heat from their bodies helped to warm the room. This was especially important in the winter months, when every source of heat was important. Pigs, cows, and sheep gave off a lot of heat, which helped to maintain a comfortable temperature in the house. Another hidden source of heat was cooking and eating together. In many homes, the fireplace or hearth was the only source of heat. Therefore, families often gathered around the hearth to cook and eat. The heat from the hearth, combined with the heat from the food being cooked, created a feeling of comfort and warmth. It was not only a way to cook food, but also a way to keep warm and spend time together. Clothing was also an important element. People wore layers of clothing made of wool and linen. Outer garments, such as cloaks and tunics, were often lined with fur. This created additional air pockets that helped to retain heat. Feet were protected by thick woolen stockings and leather boots. All clothing was designed to retain as much heat as possible and protect against the wind. Finally, there was human warmth. People slept in the same bed, sharing their warmth with each other. This was the simplest but most effective way to keep warm. The more people slept together, the warmer they were. This custom was not only a social norm, but also a practical necessity. It helped families and communities survive the harsh winters. Thus, medieval people were very inventive when it came to warmth. They used all the resources available to them, from hot stones and coals to the warmth of animals and their own bodies. Their methods were simple but very effective and allowed them to survive in conditions that seem unbearable to us modern people. The fireplace was the heart of the medieval home, its main source of heat and light. On cold winter evenings, families and servants gathered around it to warm up, talk, and listen to stories. It was not just a place to heat the home, but a real social center around which all life revolved. The fire in the hearth was a symbol of home, comfort, and well-being. For the fireplace to work effectively, it had to be used correctly. People put thick logs in it, which burned for a long time and gave off a lot of heat. They also used reflectors, metal plates that were placed behind the fireplace to reflect heat into the room. This helped to direct the precious heat to where it was most needed, instead of losing it to the cold stone walls. The wood was carefully selected. Preference was given to dense wood that burned slowly, providing a constant source of heat throughout the night. But the fireplace, like everything else in a medieval home, had its drawbacks. It was open, and most of the heat produced by the fire escaped up the chimney along with the smoke. This made it a rather inefficient way to heat a home. In addition, an open fire was dangerous and could cause a fire. Sparks could fly around the room and set fire to straw on the floor or wooden objects. Therefore, there was always someone standing by the fireplace to watch the fire. In addition to fireplaces, some homes used portable stoves or braziers. These were small clay or metal vessels in which hot coals were placed. These braziers could be moved from room to room, which made them very convenient. They were placed under tables to warm the feet during meals, or under beds to warm the bed before going to sleep. It was a simple but effective way to provide local heating where it was needed. Another important element was windows. In most medieval houses, windows were small and often had no glass. Instead, they were covered with shutters or leather, which could not provide a complete seal. Therefore, the fireplace was not just a source of heat, but a salvation from constant drafts. People tried to sit or sleep away from windows to avoid the cold air. Finally, the general lifestyle was geared toward conserving heat. In winter, people worked less outside and spent more time by the fireplace, doing crafts. Families and communities gathered in one room to warm each other. Living together was not only a social norm, but also a practical necessity. Instead of each person heating their own small corner, they joined together to make the most efficient use of the heat from a single hearth. It was the embodiment of the principle of one for all and all for one. Thus, medieval people did not simply endure the cold, but actively fought it using all the means available to them. Their solutions were not as technological as ours, but they were based on a deep understanding of nature and physics. Their ingenuity and adaptability allowed them to create comfort and warmth even in the harshest conditions. Interestingly, while warming themselves by the fireplace, medieval people often slept right there on the floor. And if they did go to bed, they did not undress completely. Why? So they wouldn't freeze. In the Middle Ages, people did not sleep naked, as is customary today. Their sleepwear was carefully designed and served several important purposes. First and foremost, it was one of the most effective ways to keep warm. People slept in underwear made of linen or cotton. This was the first layer of protection that helped to retain body heat. This was especially important in cold, unheated bedrooms, where every degree of heat counted. On top of their underwear, people wore nightgowns or simply slept in their everyday clothes. Nightgowns were long and loose, allowing them to cover most of the body and create an extra layer of air. They were made of wool or thick linen, which provided additional insulation. For the nobility, nightgowns could be decorated with embroidery, but their main function remained the same: to keep warm. The second important function of sleepwear was hygiene. In the Middle Ages, washing was a difficult and time-consuming process, so people tried to keep their bedding as long as possible. Sleeping in clothes helped to protect mattresses and blankets from dirt and sweat, which meant that bedding did not need to be washed as often. This was a practical solution in conditions where water and soap were in short supply. Layering was key. People wore several layers of clothing to create air pockets, which are excellent insulators. Sometimes they slept in hats or caps to keep their heads warm. They kept their feet warm with woolen stockings. The colder it was in the house, the more layers of clothing people wore. This strategy allowed them to adapt to changing conditions. Sleeping in clothes was not just the norm, but a necessity. In cold castles and houses where temperatures could drop to zero, sleeping naked would have been simply impossible. Sleepwear was part of an overall survival system that also included warm bedding, canopies, and other sources of heat. For travelers and warriors, who often slept in camping conditions, clothing was even more important. They slept in their armor or thick camping clothes, which helped them stay warm and be ready for any surprises. Their clothing was not just protection, but a means of survival. Thus, medieval sleepwear was not just an item of clothing. It was a technological solution that helped people survive in harsh conditions. It was multifunctional and played an important role in hygiene, insulation, and of course, heat retention. The most reliable and accessible source of heat in the Middle Ages was the warmth of the human body. In an era when central heating was an impossible dream and wood and coal were expensive luxuries, people learned to use the most valuable thing they had, each other. This method was not only practical but also vital for survival. People slept in the same bed not only to save space, but also out of necessity. The more people slept in one bed, the warmer they were. The heat emitted by each person did not dissipate in the cold room, but accumulated in the confined space of the bed, creating a kind of natural heater. This custom was widespread among all classes of society, from peasants to nobility, and was known as body warming. For poor families who could not afford warm bedding, this was the only way to keep from freezing. They slept together to keep warm. Parents, children, and sometimes distant relatives huddled together in one bed. It was their way of surviving the cold nights. This custom strengthened family ties and a sense of community, as everyone shared the same space and the same problem. But the warmth of the human body was not only used for sleeping. During the day when people were not working, they gathered around the hearth, hugging each other to keep warm. Children played near the hearth, while adults worked sitting close to each other. It was part of their daily life and helped them survive the cold winter months. This collective way of keeping warm was not only comfortable, but also helped maintain social ties. Another interesting fact is that in medieval inns and hostels, travelers could also sleep together, even if they were strangers to each other. This was economically beneficial for innkeepers and much warmer for guests. This custom was so widespread that it was considered the norm. A traveler arriving in an unfamiliar city could share a bed with several strangers, and no one was surprised. In wealthy homes with separate bedrooms, people still preferred to sleep together. This was not only because of the cold, but also because of a sense of security. At a time when crime was high, sleeping in the same bed with family or servants was much safer. Sleeping together was also a way to share important news, tell stories, and simply socialize, which was especially valuable in the absence of mass media. Over time, with the development of heating technology and building materials, this practice became a thing of the past. Beds became smaller, and separate bedrooms became the norm. But even today, when we sleep in warm homes, we can still feel the instinctive desire to snuggle up to someone to keep warm. This proves that this ancient instinct remains with us. Thus, the warmth of the human body was not just a source of heat, but a symbol of survival, community, and solidarity. It was their way of saying, we are together and we will make it through. This method was perhaps the simplest, but also the most effective of all the methods they used to combat the cold. It shows how much people depended on each other in that era. The walls of medieval houses were thick and massive. They were made of stone, clay, or wood, depending on the availability of materials in the region. Stone was used in castles and wealthy homes, while clay and wood were used in peasant dwellings. Thick walls were excellent insulators. They helped to keep the heat inside the house and protect it from the cold outside. This principle, known to us as thermal inertia, was instinctively understood by medieval builders. Walls heated during the day slowly gave off heat at night, smoothing out temperature fluctuations. To further insulate the walls, they were often covered with wooden panels or hung with tapestries and fabrics. In wealthy homes, tapestries were not just decoration, but a functional element. They created another layer of insulation that helped retain heat and protected against cold drafts coming through cracks in the masonry. These multi-layered walls made rooms much warmer than they appear at first glance. The floors in most medieval houses were made of earth or stone. To warm them up, people laid straw mats or animal skins on top. Straw was an excellent insulator. It also helped absorb moisture, which was a big problem in houses with earthen floors. Straw mats were a very practical and affordable solution, and they could be easily replaced when they became dirty. Wealthy families covered their floors with thick carpets, animal skins, and elaborate rugs, which served not only as decoration, but also as additional insulation. The straw that covered the floors was not only an insulator, but also a hygiene element. People wiped their shoes on it, and food scraps fell on it. When the straw became too dirty, it was simply replaced. It was a primitive but effective way to maintain relative cleanliness in the house. Another interesting solution was the recesses in the floor that were made in some houses. Hot coals or stones were placed in them to warm the floor and the air in the room. It was a kind of primitive underfloor heating system that allowed the house to stay warm even in the harshest frosts. Windows were another problem. They were small and often had no glass, but were closed with wooden shutters. During the cold season, the shutters were closed, but they could not completely protect against the cold and drafts. Therefore, people used leather, parchment, or thick fabric to cover the windows and protect the house from wind and cold. These materials, although they did not let light through, were effective insulators. Some wealthy homes did have glass, but it was cloudy, uneven, and very expensive. Therefore, even in such homes, the windows remained small to minimize heat loss. Thus, medieval people used all the means available to them to create a warm and cozy home. Their solutions were simple but very effective. They understood that the key to warmth was layering and insulation. And although their homes were not as comfortable as ours, they were still warm enough to survive in. Their approach to building and furnishing their homes was based on a deep understanding of nature and physics. They instinctively knew that thick walls and multiple layers of insulation were the best way to combat the cold. Unlike us, they couldn't just turn a thermostat knob. They had to rely on their own ingenuity and the materials that nature provided them. They were true masters of survival, and their experience shows that high technology is not always necessary for comfort. Medieval people were not stupid. On the contrary, their approach to survival in harsh conditions was a model of logic and common sense. They used what they had to cope with the problem of cold, and their strategy was incredibly effective. They understood that trying to heat an entire huge windswept stone house was pointless and ineffective. So they focused on what they could control: the bed. They turned it into a center of warmth and comfort where they could warm up and rest. All their ingenuity was directed toward making this space as comfortable as possible. Their methods were multi-layered. They used all the materials available to them: wool, down, and animal skins. These natural materials were excellent insulators. The former created air pockets that prevented heat from escaping, while the latter were impervious to cold and moisture. People created multi-layered structures from blankets and bedspreads, where each layer performed its own function, and together they created a reliable barrier against the cold. The bed became a kind of microclimate thanks to canopies and curtains. These heavy cloths covered the bed on all sides, creating an insulated space where the heat from the sleeping bodies did not dissipate. It was a simple but ingenious way to create a warm cocoon inside a cold room. For extra warmth, they used hot water bottles and hot coals. Clay or metal vessels filled with hot water or smoldering coals were placed under the blanket to warm the bed before bedtime. This method allowed them to immediately immerse themselves in warmth without wasting time warming up the icy sheets. People also used hot stones, which they heated in the hearth, wrapped in cloth, and placed in bed. They slept not only in warm clothes, but also together. This was the simplest but most effective way to keep warm. The warmth of the human body was the most reliable source of heat. The more people slept in one bed, the warmer they were. This custom was widespread among all strata of society, from peasants to nobility, and was not only a practical necessity, but also a social norm. All this was part of their wise strategy for combating the cold. They did not tackle the problem head-on, but approached it intelligently, using what they had. Their solutions were not as technological as ours, but they were based on a deep understanding of physics and common sense. And this strategy worked. They slept warmer than we can imagine. Their logic extended to other areas of life. In winter, they spent less time outside and more time by the hearth, doing crafts and socializing. This was not only for warmth, but also to conserve energy. They took every opportunity to conserve heat and energy. Thus, medieval people were masters of survival. Their approach to the cold was not just patience, but an active and wise strategy that allowed them to create comfort even in the harshest conditions. They were smart, resourceful, and knew how to use what they had. So, despite the lack of central heating, medieval people slept warmer than we think. They used all the means available to them to create comfort and warmth in their homes. Their main strategy was to create a microclimate in bed using layered bedding, canopies, hot water bottles, and body heat. They did not try to heat the entire house, but focused on what they could control. It makes no sense to heat a huge stone hall, so they focused on what they could control. This wise strategy allowed them to survive in harsh conditions using common sense and natural materials. They were masters of survival, and their experience shows that high technology is not always necessary for comfort. Which medieval heating techniques do you think could be useful in our modern world? Share your opinion in the comments.